My name is Ethan Cole, and for most of my adult life, I measured love in hours worked instead of hours spent at home. I was 42 years old, built like the kind of man who spent more time carrying steel than talking about feelings, and for the last 13 years I'd worked offshore oil platforms scattered across the Gulf. The rigs were loud, dangerous, and lonely in a way that slowly hollowed a person out without them noticing. You lived surrounded by metal, salt air, diesel fumes, and men who learned early that silence was easier than honesty. Out there, days blurred together into machinery checks, emergency drills, burnt coffee, and the endless rhythm of waves slamming steel pillars beneath your feet. You learned to sleep through alarms. You learned to ignore pain until it interfered with the job. And if you were gone long enough, you learned how to convince yourself your family understood why you missed everything that mattered. I told myself that every single time I watched another birthday through a grainy video call that froze every few seconds. I told myself that when Lily lost her 7th grade softball game and Vanessa sent me a picture afterward because I couldn't be there. I told myself that when I forgot our anniversary 2 years in a row because somewhere in my head all dates had started feeling like coordinates instead of memories. I'll make it up someday, I used to tell Lily whenever she sounded disappointed on the phone. Someday became the kind of word that can quietly ruin a family. The explosion happened on a Thursday morning just after sunrise. We were running diagnostics on one of the pressure systems when something underneath the west platform failed hard enough to shake the entire rig. I remember the sound first, not loud exactly, but deep, like the ocean itself cracking open beneath us. Then came the fire. A burst of orange rolled across the lower deck, followed by screaming over the radios and the metallic shriek of emergency shutdown systems kicking in all at once. One of the younger guys named Morales got thrown against a railing hard enough to break his shoulder. Another worker took shrapnel to the leg. Training takes over in moments like that. You stop thinking emotionally. You move. You drag people clear. You shut valves. You count bodies. By the time the helicopters arrived, black smoke had swallowed half the morning sky. Nobody died, which offshore workers considered a miracle. But the platform was shut down indefinitely pending federal inspection, and suddenly 200 exhausted men found themselves without work for the next month and a half. I should have stayed in company housing near Galveston until reassignment. Most guys did. But the moment they told us operations were suspended, all I could think about was home. About surprising Lily. About maybe finally showing up instead of apologizing for not showing up. So I packed my duffel bag, caught a shuttle into town, and rented an old pickup from a mechanic near the docks without telling Vanessa or Lily I was coming. The drive north should have felt peaceful. Instead it felt strange from the beginning. The sky was heavy with incoming rain, low gray clouds dragging shadows across the highway while Gulf wind rattled the truck hard enough to make the steering wheel vibrate in my hands. I texted Lily around noon. Guess who might be home early? No response. That wasn't entirely unusual. 13-year-olds lived on their phones until you actually wanted them to answer. An hour later, I tried again. You at softball practice? Nothing. Somewhere outside Beaumont, I finally called Vanessa. She answered too quickly, like she'd been staring at the phone before picking up. Hey, I said, smiling despite myself. Got a surprise for you. Silence. Then, Ethan, her voice sounded thin somehow. Controlled. Yeah? Another pause. Long enough for the smile to fade off my face. I thought you weren't coming back until July. Something about the way she said it tightened every muscle in my chest. Not excitement. Not relief. It sounded almost like panic trying to disguise itself as confusion. I laughed anyway because that was easier than listening to my instincts. Platform shut down after an accident. I'm already halfway home. Oh. Just that. Oh. Where's Lily? I asked. She didn't answer my texts. Vanessa hesitated again. She's out right now. Out where? Just with people from school. The answer came too fast that time, like she'd prepared it while I was asking. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Everything okay? Of course, she said immediately. Too immediately. Drive safe. Then she hung up before I could ask anything else. By the time I reached our neighborhood, rain had started falling hard enough to blur the windshield. Our house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac lined with soaked pine trees bending in the wind. The porch light was on even though it was barely evening. I remember thinking the house looked smaller than I remembered, tired somehow. I carried my duffel bag up the front steps expecting Lily to burst out laughing when she saw me. Instead, the house was silent. Not normal silence either. Dead silence. The kind that feels staged. Lily? I called as I stepped inside. No answer. The air smelled faintly of bleach and lavender candles. Vanessa wasn't downstairs. I walked toward Lily's room with that growing pressure in my chest getting worse with every step. Her bedroom door was half open. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. The walls were bare. Her sketches were gone. The small watercolor paintings she used to tape beside her desk had disappeared. Shelves that once overflowed with books, softball trophies, and art supplies now sat nearly empty except for a lamp and a folded blanket. Even worse were the missing photographs. There had been dozens before. Family pictures, vacation snapshots, Drawings she'd taped beside framed photos of the three of us together. Now there were only pale square outlines on the walls where frames used to hang. Her sketchbooks were gone too. Every single one. I slowly walked farther into the room until I reached the desk near the window. One thing remained sitting alone in the center drawer. A black charcoal pencil snapped cleanly in half. I picked it up carefully, and for the first time since leaving the oil platform, real fear settled into my stomach. Something was wrong in this house. Deeply wrong. And whatever it was, I already knew it had something to do with my daughter. I stood in Lily's room for what could have been 5 minutes or 50, staring at the pale outlines where our family photos used to hang while rain hammered the windows hard enough to sound like gravel against the glass. My reflection in the darkened window barely looked familiar anymore. Oil-stained jacket. Exhaustion carved into my face. Hands still scraped from pulling injured men across burning steel less than 24 hours earlier. I had survived explosions, storms in open water, and machinery failures that could kill a man in seconds, but somehow nothing had ever made me feel as helpless as standing inside my daughter's half-empty bedroom holding half of a broken charcoal pencil. I heard Vanessa downstairs before I saw her. The front door opened softly, followed by the sound of wet shoes against hardwood. For a second I almost wanted to believe there was some reasonable explanation waiting downstairs. Boarding school, art camp, therapy retreat, something normal, something I could understand. But deep down, instincts I'd spent years sharpening on oil rigs were already screaming at me that this wasn't normal. Men who worked offshore survived by listening to tiny feelings something was wrong before disaster actually happened. A vibration in the floor. A strange smell in the air. Pressure gauges slightly off. Ignore those feelings long enough and people died. Vanessa was standing in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Her blonde hair was tied back carelessly, mascara smudged beneath her eyes like she'd been rubbing them for hours. She froze when she saw me fully, like somehow part of her had still hoped I wasn't actually there. "Where's Lily?" I asked again. My voice sounded calm, but it wasn't. Calm was just the lid I kept welded over anger. Vanessa set her purse down slowly. "Ethan, don't start with my name." I stepped closer. "Where is our daughter?" Her eyes shifted away first. That told me more than words could have. "She's safe." Safe. People only use that word when someone clearly isn't nearby. "Where?" Silence stretched between us while rain rattled the windows. Finally she whispered, "North Peak Leadership Academy." The name landed wrong immediately. Too polished. Too rehearsed. What the hell is that? It's a program. What kind of program? A therapeutic leadership school for struggling teens. I actually laughed once because the sentence sounded insane out loud. Lily isn't a struggling teen. Vanessa's jaw tightened instantly. "You don't know that because you're never here." The words hit harder than I expected because part of me feared they were true. She stopped talking to people, Ethan. Her grades dropped. She got suspended twice this year. For what? Vanessa hesitated. Skipping class. I stared at her. That's what got our 13-year-old daughter shipped away. It wasn't just that, she snapped suddenly, months of pressure cracking open in her voice. She stopped sleeping. She stopped eating properly. She locked herself in her room for days drawing those dark, horrible pictures, and every time I tried to talk to her, she shut me out completely. "So you sent her away?" I tried everything else first. She sounded desperate now, almost pleading with me to understand. Therapists, school counselors, support groups, nothing worked. Then I found North Peak Online. They specialize in rebuilding confidence and discipline in emotionally withdrawn children. I leaned both hands against the kitchen counter because suddenly I felt physically sick. "You sent my daughter to strangers I've never even heard of? They're licensed. I don't care." My voice rose for the first time. "You don't send a child away without telling her father." Vanessa looked at me then with an anger I hadn't noticed growing all these years beneath her exhaustion. "You weren't here, Ethan. Somebody had to make decisions." The sentence hit with brutal precision because it attacked the exact guilt I spent years trying not to think about. Every missed birthday. Every school concert watched through bad cell phone reception from an oil platform cafeteria. Every promise that someday things would slow down. Someday I'd be home more. Someday I'd make it right. I swallowed hard. Did Lily want to go? Vanessa looked away again. That was answer enough. She begged me not to send her, she admitted quietly. Rage moved through me so fast it almost blurred my vision. Jesus Christ. You don't understand how bad things got. Then explain it to me. I couldn't reach her anymore, Vanessa shouted. And I couldn't reach you either. Silence crashed down afterward. The rain outside seemed louder now. Colder. Finally I asked, "Where is this place?" She hesitated before grabbing her phone and pulling up directions. "It's in the mountains near Black Hollow County. About 6 hours north." 6 hours. My daughter was 6 hours away, and I hadn't even known she was gone. I left before Vanessa could stop me. Maybe she didn't try because she knew there was no stopping me anymore. Night had fully settled by the time I reached the highway leading into the mountain region. The farther north I drove, the emptier the roads became. Pine forests swallowed the landscape on both sides, dark and endless beneath low storm clouds that smothered the moonlight. Cell service faded in and out. The roads narrowed from highway to cracked blacktop, then eventually to winding dirt paths cutting through dense woods. Every few miles I spotted cameras mounted high on utility poles facing the road, watching, recording. My stomach tightened harder each time I saw one. Around midnight, I finally passed a rusted metal sign partially hidden between trees. North Peak Leadership Academy, building stronger children through accountability. The slogan sounded corporate and cold, like something written by a man who had never actually comforted a child in his life. Beyond the sign stood tall wire fencing nearly invisible behind thick pine trees. Security lights glowed faintly deeper in the property. Then I saw them. Kids. At least a dozen moving through the darkness carrying stacks of lumber toward a long gray building near the tree line. They wore matching dark jackets despite the freezing rain. No parents. No teachers smiling reassuringly. No sounds of children laughing. Just silence and work. One boy stumbled under the weight of the wood he carried, and an adult barked something sharp enough that the kid immediately straightened again. Every instinct in my body screamed now. This wasn't therapy. This wasn't school. This place felt wrong in the way abandoned prisons feel wrong. I parked farther down the road and walked the fence line until I reached the main compound. Several buildings sat spread across the mountainside beneath harsh floodlights. Dormitories. Storage sheds. A cafeteria near the center. Through one illuminated cafeteria window, I finally saw her. Lily sat alone at the end of a long table wearing a gray uniform sweatshirt 2 sizes too big for her. Her curly dark hair had been cut shorter. Her shoulders were hunched inward like she was trying to disappear inside herself. And the expression on her face wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger either. It was fear. Pure, exhausted fear. I don't remember deciding to climb the fence. One second I was standing in the freezing mountain rain staring through that cafeteria window at my daughter looking smaller than I had ever seen her in my life. And the next my hands were gripping cold chain link wire while 30 years of exhaustion and guilt pushed me upward like something violent had finally broken loose inside my chest. The fence tore my palms open in 2 places, but I barely felt it. I dropped into wet gravel on the other side and crouched low behind a maintenance shed while floodlights swept slowly across the yard. The entire property smelled like damp wood, diesel fuel, and industrial cleaning chemicals. Somewhere deeper in the compound, a whistle blew sharply through the night, followed by movement from several children crossing between buildings carrying buckets and tool crates. None of them spoke. That silence bothered me more than anything else. Children are supposed to make noise. Even sad kids make noise eventually. But these kids moved like workers at the end of a 12-hour shift, shoulders bent, eyes down, every motion careful and automatic. I waited until a staff member disappeared around the corner of the cafeteria before slipping toward the building through the shadows. Through the side entrance window, I could see rows of metal tables inside beneath harsh fluorescent lights. The room looked less like a school cafeteria and more like a correctional facility trying to pretend otherwise. Gray walls. Security cameras in every corner. Posters about discipline and accountability hanging beside schedules broken down almost minute by minute. Wake UP. 4:45 a.m. Morning conditioning. Work detail. Reflection period. Character reinforcement. There was nothing in that room that looked remotely connected to childhood. I slipped through the unlocked side door while several students were stacking trays near the kitchen. Nobody noticed me at first. My heartbeat felt so loud I was certain the entire building could hear it. Then Lily looked up. For one terrible second, she didn't react at all. She just stared at me from across the room with exhausted hollow eyes, frozen so completely that my brain actually wondered if she recognized me. She looked thinner than she had through the window. The oversized gray sweatshirt hung loose around her frame, sleeves pulled over bruised hands that looked raw from cold weather and work. There were dark circles beneath her eyes that no 13-year-old should ever have. Her expression slowly changed from confusion to something far more painful. Oh, careful, terrified hope. She stood up too quickly, bumping the table hard enough that another girl beside her flinched instinctively. "Dad?" she whispered. Her voice cracked apart on the word. I crossed the room before I even realized I was moving. Lily. The moment I reached her, she grabbed onto me so hard it nearly knocked the air out of my lungs. She was shaking violently. Not crying yet. Just shaking like someone standing outside in freezing rain too long. I wrapped both arms around her and felt every ounce of fear I'd been holding back explode inside my chest. She felt too light. "Hey," I whispered into her hair. "I got you. I'm here." She pulled back suddenly just enough to stare at my face like she still wasn't entirely convinced I was real. "You came?" The question destroyed me because of how shocked she sounded asking it. "Of course I came." Her lips trembled. "They told me you signed the transfer papers." My stomach dropped. "What papers?" Lily's eyes darted nervously toward the security camera in the corner before lowering again. "The director said you finally admitted I was too difficult to handle at home." I stared at her, unable to process the sentence at first because it was simply too cruel for my brain to accept immediately. What? They said Mom agreed, but you were the one who pushed for it. Her breathing became shaky now, tears finally slipping free. They said you stopped wanting me there. I felt something dark and dangerous move through my body then. The kind of anger that arrives so deep it becomes cold instead of loud. Lily, listen to me carefully. I held her face gently so she'd look directly at me. I never signed anything. I didn't even know this place existed until tonight. She searched my eyes desperately, trying to decide whether she could trust what she was hearing after however many weeks of manipulation these people had buried inside her head. Then suddenly she broke completely. The crying came all at once, violent and uncontrollable, the kind that bends a person forward because their body physically can't contain the pain anymore. I held her while she cried against my chest, and slowly I became aware of the room around us growing quieter. Other children were watching now, some openly, some pretending not to while listening to every word. One small boy near the dish station couldn't have been older than 9. His face looked pale and exhausted beneath a shaved haircut that made him appear even smaller. He stepped closer cautiously. Are you taking all of us? He asked quietly. The question hit harder than almost anything else that night because of how normal he tried to make it sound. Not hopeful, not demanding, just tired. Like someone asking whether rain was coming tomorrow. I looked around the cafeteria properly then, and for the first time I truly saw them. Every child in that room looked wrong somehow. Too thin, too quiet, too careful. Several had cracked skin across their hands. One girl limped slightly carrying trays. Another boy had healing bruises near his jawline partially hidden beneath his collar. And every single one of them watched adults the way abused animals do, constantly measuring mood, danger, permission. Lily's fingers tightened around my jacket. They monitor our calls, she whispered quickly through tears. They read our letters before they send them. If we say negative things, we lose meal privileges. My chest tightened so hard it hurt to breathe. They make us work outside every day, she continued. If someone cries or refuses, they call it emotional resistance. Then they isolate you. What kind of work? Construction, lumber, cleaning, farming in the lower fields. She swallowed hard. Sometimes 14 hours. 14 hours. My 13-year-old daughter had been turned into labor under the label of therapy. They tell us families abandon weak kids, Lily whispered. They say obedience is how you earn love back. I closed my eyes for one brief second because if I didn't, I genuinely thought I might kill someone. Then a calm voice behind me said, Mr. Cole, you're trespassing. I turned slowly. Graham Voss stood near the cafeteria entrance wearing a dark wool coat over perfectly pressed clothes, his silver hair untouched by the rain outside. He looked less like the director of a youth academy and more like a corporate executive arriving for a dinner meeting. But his eyes were the thing I noticed immediately. Calm, controlled, completely without warmth. He folded his hands together politely while several staff members appeared behind him near the doorway. I understand emotions are running high, he said smoothly, but entering private property without authorization is extremely inappropriate. Lily immediately stiffened beside me in fear. And the fact that she feared this man more than she trusted adults told me everything I needed to know about what kind of place North Peak really was. The strange thing about Graham Voss was that if you heard him speak for only 30 seconds, you might actually believe he was a good man. That was what made him dangerous. Truly dangerous people rarely looked like monsters. Monsters were easy to fight because everyone recognized them immediately. Men like Voss survived because they sounded reasonable enough for exhausted parents to hand over their children willingly. He stood near the cafeteria entrance with his hands calmly folded in front of him while rainwater dripped softly from my jacket onto the floor between us. Behind him, 2 staff members watched carefully without speaking, both broad-shouldered men dressed in dark outdoor uniforms that looked more security than education. The children had gone completely silent now. Even the smallest movements in the room seemed to stop the moment Voss appeared. Lily instinctively moved closer behind me, fingers gripping the back of my coat tightly enough that I could feel her shaking through the fabric. Voss noticed it too. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened briefly like he was evaluating whether I had already become a problem. I understand this situation appears alarming from an emotional perspective, he said in a smooth, measured voice that sounded practiced over years of parent meetings and fundraising dinners. But I assure you North Peak operates entirely within therapeutic and educational guidelines. I stared at him without answering because I'd spent enough years around corporate managers on oil platforms to recognize rehearsed language when I heard it. Men who cause disasters always learned how to explain them calmly afterward. Your daughter is going through a difficult developmental period, Voss continued. Children today are drowning in distraction, emotional impulsivity, and a lack of accountability. Most parents unfortunately respond by becoming permissive instead of corrective. His tone remained perfectly controlled, almost gentle. That was the disturbing part. He wasn't ranting like some lunatic cult leader. He sounded like a man giving a lecture at a parenting conference. We provide structure, he said. Discipline. Responsibility. The opportunity to rebuild resilience through productive labor and personal accountability. Productive labor. My jaw tightened at the phrase. Not work. Not forced labor. Productive labor. Every ugly thing this place did had been polished into softer language first. I looked around the cafeteria again while he talked. At first glance, it almost worked. Clean floors. Organized schedules. Quiet children. To outsiders, this probably looked like order. Stability. But once you noticed the details, the illusion started rotting immediately. The bruises hidden beneath sleeves. The exhaustion in their faces. The way every child monitored adults before speaking. The way Lily still hadn't let go of my coat for even 1 second. Voss noticed where my eyes were moving and adjusted smoothly. Many children arrive emotionally dysregulated, he explained. Defiant behavior, depression, manipulative tendencies, screen addiction. Traditional parenting methods are increasingly ineffective. Lily lowered her head immediately at the word manipulative, like she'd heard it directed at her too many times already. That nearly pushed me over the edge by itself. She's 13, I said coldly. Not a criminal. No, Voss agreed calmly. She's a child in need of correction before adulthood hardens those tendencies permanently. It was horrifying because part of what he said almost sounded logical if you ignored everything else around you. That was how places like this survive. They gave frightened parents a version of discipline that sounded responsible. They sold fear wrapped in professionalism. And people wanted to believe it because believing it meant somebody else could solve problems they no longer knew how to handle themselves. I thought about Vanessa then. Tired. Alone. Drowning slowly while I spent years offshore telling myself I was providing for my family. I could suddenly see exactly how a man like Graham Voss entered people's lives. He didn't force doors open. He waited until desperation opened them willingly. You told my daughter I abandoned her, I said quietly. Voss tilted his head slightly. We encourage students to confront difficult emotional truths. That's not what I asked. Children often reinterpret temporary parental separation emotionally. We help them develop healthier frameworks. The calmness in his voice somehow made everything worse. He genuinely believed language could erase cruelty if you polished it enough. Then he reached calmly into a leather folder one of the staff members handed him and removed several documents. MRS. Cole signed a voluntary residential placement agreement, he said. North Peak therefore has temporary custodial authority regarding Lily's educational and therapeutic care. He handed me the paperwork. Vanessa's signature stared back at me from the bottom of multiple pages. Under state law, Voss continued, removing your daughter without authorization could create legal complications regarding custodial interference. I looked up slowly. You threatening me? I'm informing you of procedure. Lily's grip tightened again behind me. Dad, she whispered quietly, fear creeping into her voice now. Not fear of me. Fear of what this man might do next. I ignored Voss and looked directly at her instead. How long have you been here? 7 weeks. 7 weeks. 7 weeks while I worked 12-hour shifts surrounded by machinery believing my daughter was safe at home. How much do they make you work? Lily hesitated before answering because even now she was scared to say the wrong thing aloud. Depends. On what? Punishments. Something moved inside my chest then. Something dark enough that I had to physically unclench my fists. Voss noticed. Physical responsibility is part of our development model, he explained smoothly. Hardship builds resilience. Right then a whistle blew outside. Through the cafeteria windows I saw several children moving across the snowy yard carrying stacks of firewood toward the dormitory buildings. Snow fell heavily now, thick white sheets blowing sideways through floodlights. One small boy near the back stumbled under the weight of the wood in his arms. He tried to stand again, failed, and collapsed hard into the snow. Nobody ran to help him. Not immediately. The children froze. One staff member shouted something from across the yard about discipline and performance. The boy tried to push himself back up despite barely being able to move. I took a step toward the window instinctively. What the hell is wrong with him? Voss barely glanced outside. MR. Turner struggles with perseverance during weather exposure. I turned slowly toward him because for a moment I genuinely couldn't believe another human being had just said those words. He's a child. He's learning accountability. The staff member outside finally walked over, not to help the boy, but to force him back onto his feet by grabbing his arm hard enough that the child cried out even through the storm. That was the exact moment something inside me changed permanently. Up until then, part of me still wanted an explanation. Some misunderstanding. Some hidden complexity that made this place less evil than it felt. But watching that child struggle to stand while adults treated suffering like curriculum burned the last bit of doubt out of me completely. Lily looked up at me then with exhausted, frightened eyes that no longer looked 13 at all. And suddenly I understood the most important thing in the world. If I left tonight without her, this place would bury her piece by piece until eventually she believed everything they told her about herself. Weak, difficult, unwanted. No father survives hearing that realization quietly without becoming dangerous. I looked back at the locked dormitory buildings outside and noticed something I hadn't fully processed before. Security guards were locking the doors from the outside after each group of children entered. Not schools. Not therapy centers. Containment. Voss followed my gaze and smiled faintly, like he knew exactly what I was realizing. Structure requires boundaries, he said calmly. I stared at him for a long moment while snow battered the windows behind us and frightened children pretended not to listen nearby. Then I made my decision. I was taking Lily out of this place tonight no matter what it cost me. I waited nearly 2 hours before making my move. 2 hours sitting inside my truck half a mile down the mountain road while snow hammered the windshield hard enough to blur the world outside into shifting white shadows. The heater rattled weakly. My hands still smelled faintly like diesel and metal from the oil platform, and every few minutes I caught myself gripping the steering wheel hard enough to ache because if I stopped moving entirely, rage started taking over again. I kept seeing Lily's face in that cafeteria, the fear in her eyes when Voss spoke, the way she instinctively lowered her voice before answering simple questions. Children are not supposed to move through life like inmates waiting for permission to breathe. I had spent years offshore surrounded by men who worked dangerous jobs because they believed sacrifice was what fathers were supposed to do. We missed holidays, missed anniversaries, missed entire pieces of our children growing up. We told ourselves the paycheck justified the distance. But sitting there in the freezing dark outside North Peak, I realized something that made me physically sick. I had spent so much time making a living that I almost lost the people I was trying to live for in the first place. Around midnight, the compound lights dimmed slightly except for perimeter floodlights and security towers near the fencing. I watched patterns carefully the same way I used to monitor machinery rhythms offshore. Guards rotated every 20 minutes. One patrol circled the dormitories. Another monitored the lower maintenance buildings. Snowstorm conditions were getting worse, which helped me more than it hurt. Visibility had dropped badly enough that the cameras probably weren't catching much beyond movement. I pulled my hood low and moved through the tree line toward the back dormitory where I'd seen Lily enter earlier. The snow reached nearly to my knees in some places, soaking my jeans and numbing my legs almost immediately. By the time I reached the building, my heartbeat was pounding so hard I could hear it over the wind. A heavy chain wrapped through the outside door handles confirmed what I already suspected. They weren't housing children here. They were containing them. I worked the side maintenance entrance instead and managed to force it open with a rusted pry bar I'd taken from my truck. Warm, stale air hit me immediately as I slipped inside. The dormitory smelled like detergent, damp clothing, and exhaustion. Rows of metal bunk beds filled the room beneath dim emergency lights. Some children were asleep, others weren't. I could tell by the way eyes opened instantly the moment I entered. Not startled. Conditioned. Hyper alert the way people become when they stop feeling safe. Lily was near the far wall curled beneath a thin gray blanket. For one terrible second she looked even younger asleep. All the fear stripped away temporarily until she just resembled the little girl who used to fall asleep on the couch holding colored pencils after drawing too long. I crouched beside her carefully and touched her shoulder. Lily. Her eyes flew open instantly in panic before recognition hit. Dad? Shh. I pressed a finger gently to my lips. We're leaving. The words changed her expression so fast it nearly broke me. Hope and terror collided together because somewhere inside her she still couldn't fully believe rescue was real. She sat up immediately, movements tense and quick. Nearby, several other children had quietly risen from their bunks listening. One small boy I recognized from the cafeteria stepped closer, clutching a blanket around his shoulders. Caleb, 9 years old at most. His voice was barely audible beneath the wind outside. Will they punish us if you fail? The question hit me harder than anything else that night because no child should think that way. Kids are supposed to believe adults protect them automatically. But these children had learned something different here. They had learned survival. Consequences. Fear. They no longer thought like children. They thought like prisoners calculating risk. I looked around at all the silent, exhausted faces watching me from the darkness. Nobody is getting punished tonight, I whispered firmly. You hear me? None of them looked convinced. Lily quickly shoved a small notebook and folded papers into her sweatshirt pocket while my brain raced through possibilities. I wanted to take every single kid out of there. God help me, I wanted to tear the entire building apart and carry all of them into the truck if I had to. But reality was colder than rage. I needed to get Lily out first, then come back with police. Proof. Authorities. Come on, I whispered. We slipped through the maintenance door into brutal wind almost immediately. Snow blasted sideways across the property beneath floodlights while alarms suddenly exploded somewhere near the administration building. My stomach dropped. They knew. Move, I snapped instinctively, grabbing Lily's hand. Searchlights immediately began sweeping across the snowfields while distant voices shouted between buildings. Somewhere behind us, metal doors slammed open. Security teams. Lily stumbled beside me through deep snow, breathing hard. She was exhausted already. Malnourished. Overworked. My anger kept growing with every second I watched her struggle just to keep pace. Then I heard crying somewhere off to our right. Small. Weak. I turned instinctively toward a supply shed partially buried in drifting snow and spotted a child collapsed beside stacked firewood. The same boy I'd seen fall earlier. He couldn't have been older than 10. His lips looked pale blue beneath the storm. "Please," he whispered when he saw me. "I can't feel my legs." I didn't even think about it. I scooped him into my arms immediately despite already dragging Lily through worsening snow. The kid weighed almost nothing. Behind us, flashlights were getting closer now. Men shouting directions. "This way," someone yelled through the storm. Lily looked terrified. "Dad, keep moving." My legs burned as we pushed through knee-deep snow toward the tree line. Years of offshore labor were the only reason I could carry the boy at all while forcing my body uphill through the storm. Every breath felt like inhaling knives. Branches snapped under my boots while floodlights sliced through the woods behind us. At one point I heard dogs barking somewhere lower on the mountain and realized with cold horror they were actually hunting us. Lily suddenly grabbed my sleeve hard. "Why did you come back?" she asked breathlessly while we stumbled downhill through snow-covered trees. The question nearly stopped me cold because even now some part of her still needed reassurance. Still feared abandonment more than freezing to death in the woods. I looked directly at her despite the storm. "I never stopped coming back for you," I said. Her face crumpled slightly at the words, but she kept moving. We finally burst from the tree line onto the narrow mountain highway where my truck sat half hidden beneath snowdrifts. Relief hit me so hard my knees nearly gave out. Then flashing red and blue lights suddenly exploded across the road ahead. Multiple police vehicles. State troopers. The entire highway lit up beneath spinning emergency lights while officers stepped from their cruisers reaching toward their weapons. Lily froze beside me in terror. And for one horrible second, I truly believed North Peak had convinced the authorities that I was the criminal. The first thing the female state trooper noticed wasn't me. It was the boy in my arms. Snow covered all three of us by the time we stumbled onto the highway beneath flashing police lights. But the kid I carried looked worse than cold. His lips had turned pale gray. His small hands were cracked raw from exposure, and every few seconds his body shivered violently enough that I could feel it through my jacket. The troopers stepped out cautiously at first, hands hovering near holsters because from their perspective a large, exhausted man was emerging from the woods at 1 a.m. carrying a child while alarms echoed somewhere deep in the mountains behind him. Then Lily flinched. One officer raised his voice slightly telling us to stop, and Lily instinctively recoiled hard enough to almost fall backward like she expected punishment. The female trooper saw it immediately. I watched the entire situation change in her eyes in less than 2 seconds. Experienced people notice fear responses fast. Real fear looks different from guilt. It lives in the muscles before the face catches up. "Easy," she said quickly to the other officers while stepping toward us through the snow. She kept her voice calm. "Controlled. Sir, put the child down slowly so EMS can look at him." I lowered the boy carefully beside the highway barrier while Lily stayed glued to my side, trembling violently. Up close, the trooper's expression tightened immediately as she looked between the children. Bruised hands. Malnourished faces. Exhaustion so deep it looked carved into them physically. "What happened?" she asked quietly. I looked directly at her and said the simplest truth I had left. "That place up there is hurting kids." Behind us another set of headlights approached fast through the storm. North Peak security vehicles. Several men climbed out immediately, including Graham Voss himself, still perfectly composed despite snow collecting across his expensive coat. "Officer," he called calmly over the wind, "those children are residents of North Peak Leadership Academy. This man illegally entered our property and abducted them." The female trooper didn't even look at him immediately. She was still watching Lily, who had gone completely rigid the second Voss's voice reached her. That reaction alone told the trooper more than any speech I could have given. "Miss," the trooper asked gently, "are you afraid of going back there?" Lily didn't answer verbally. She just nodded once without looking up. The silence afterward felt enormous. Voss recovered quickly. Men like him always did. Traumatized adolescents often display attachment confusion during corrective interventions, he explained smoothly. North Peak specializes in emotionally resistant children. The trooper finally turned toward him then, and I saw something harden in her expression. "Did you just describe fear as resistance?" she asked flatly. For the first time all night, Graham Voss looked slightly less certain. Things moved fast after that. Ambulances arrived first, then county deputies, then investigators from Child Protective Services after the trooper radioed emergency concerns about possible abuse and unlawful detention. The storm kept getting worse while officers spread across the property with flashlights and search teams. I sat in the back of an ambulance beside Lily wrapped in thermal blankets while paramedics examined the small boy whose name turned out to be Caleb Mercer. Severe dehydration. Possible hypothermia. Untreated respiratory infection. He was 9 years old. 9. I watched grown medical professionals exchange silent looks over his condition while trying not to visibly react. Lily barely spoke during the first hour. Every loud sound made her tense. Every time a staff member passed nearby, she lowered her eyes automatically like she expected consequences for existing incorrectly. Trauma has physical posture. I understood that now. Around 3 in the morning, investigators began bringing children down from the compound in groups. Some cried openly once they reached police vehicles. Others looked emotionally numb beyond their age. One girl kept apologizing repeatedly to paramedics for being difficult while they treated infected cuts on her hands. Another boy asked officers whether sleeping indoors without permission counted as rule breaking. That was the moment I realized North Peak hadn't simply controlled these children physically. They had rewired them psychologically. Dawn arrived gray and freezing over the mountains while the investigation exploded outward piece by piece. Detectives searched workshops hidden behind the main buildings and discovered entire production operations run almost entirely by children. Furniture construction, agricultural packaging, metal fabrication, leadership products, North Peak called them in donor brochures, handmade tables, outdoor equipment, organic produce contracts sold to private distributors across 3 states. Millions of dollars moving through accounts tied to charitable foundations and youth rehabilitation grants. The children were the labor force. Every discipline exercise had generated profit. Every punishment became productivity. Investigators uncovered falsified therapy records claiming children received counseling sessions that never happened. Medical files altered to hide injuries. Donor reports featuring staged photographs of smiling students performing life skills development. One detective described the place as a labor operation disguised as emotional treatment. But the worst discovery came later that afternoon when digital forensic teams started pulling archived complaint records from county systems. Multiple anonymous reports had been filed against North Peak over the last 6 years. Allegations of abuse, malnutrition, isolation, forced labor, missing contact with children. Most had quietly disappeared after insufficient evidence findings. One former employee had even reported children being locked inside dormitories overnight during winter storms. The complaint vanished 3 days later. Somebody had buried this place repeatedly. That realization spread through the investigators like poison because suddenly North Peak stopped looking like one abusive academy and started looking like a system protected by money, influence, and people who preferred not to look too closely. Vanessa arrived just after noon. I almost didn't recognize her walking across the emergency staging area wrapped in a borrowed coat with tears streaking down her face. She saw Lily first and immediately broke apart emotionally. "Baby," she started. Lily stepped backward instantly. That reaction hit Vanessa harder than if Lily had screamed at her. I watched the truth finally land fully inside my wife's face. Not just guilt, horror, realization. She had sent our daughter into this place because she wanted relief badly enough to ignore the warning signs. The edited phone calls, the restricted visits, the strange rules. She had wanted someone else to solve the loneliness and sadness growing inside our daughter because she no longer knew how. And now she was staring at the result. "I thought they were helping her," Vanessa whispered through tears. Lily looked exhausted more than angry. "They kept telling us our parents didn't want us anymore." Vanessa physically staggered hearing that. I almost reached for her automatically out of old instinct, but stopped myself. Some truths deserved to hit without interruption. By evening, the media helicopters arrived, then satellite trucks, then national reporters. North Peak Youth Program under investigation. Child labor allegations. Abuse claims surface. The story spread across every network within hours because America has a particular horror reserved for institutions that weaponize childhood. But the truly terrifying part came next. Former students began calling investigators from all over the country. Adults now, some in their 20s, some older. They described the same patterns going back over a decade. Isolation, forced labor, punishments disguised as therapy, emotional conditioning designed to convince children their families had abandoned them. One former student told investigators, "They didn't beat obedience into you. They convinced you nobody would ever come back for you, so eventually you stopped trying to leave." I sat beside Lily in the hospital waiting area later that night while snow continued falling outside the windows, and for the first time since reaching North Peak, she finally fell asleep against my shoulder. Exhausted, safe for the moment. I stared out at the storm thinking about how close I'd come to losing her without ever understanding it was happening. And somewhere deep beneath the guilt and fury burning through me, another realization slowly took shape. This story was no longer just about my daughter anymore. It was about every child that place had swallowed while adults convinced themselves discipline and cruelty were somehow the same thing. The hardest part came after the rescue. People imagine survival as the ending because movies train us to think danger stops the second someone gets pulled out of the fire, but real trauma doesn't work that way. Sometimes the body escapes long before the mind understands it's safe. We returned home 3 days after North Peak was shut down, and from the outside everything looked almost normal again. Same yellow porch light, same rain-stained driveway, same pine trees swaying outside Lily's bedroom window. But the house felt different now because we were different inside it. Vanessa moved into her sister's apartment temporarily while investigators continued interviewing parents, and for the first time in years the house became painfully quiet. Just me and Lily existing carefully around each other like survivors waking up after the same shipwreck. I quit the offshore contract a week after we got back. My supervisor thought I was losing my mind. Men didn't walk away from that kind of salary unless something catastrophic happened. The truth was something catastrophic had happened. I had finally realized money could keep a roof over your child's head while still failing to protect what mattered underneath it. I spent years believing fatherhood was a math equation. Work harder, earn more, sacrifice now so your family could have stability later. Someday. Everything in my life had revolved around someday. Someday I'd take Lily fishing again. Someday I'd stop missing birthdays. Someday I'd be home enough to actually notice when my daughter stopped smiling. But children don't live in someday. They live in now. And while I was out in the Gulf surviving storms and explosions, my daughter had been slowly disappearing right in front of us. The nightmares started immediately after she came home. Sometimes I'd hear her screaming through the walls around 2 or 3 in the morning and find her sitting upright in bed shaking violently, unable to fully separate dreams from memory yet. Other nights she'd wake up silently and just check the bedroom door over and over again to make sure it unlocked from the inside. The first time I noticed her asking permission before eating nearly destroyed me completely. We were sitting at the kitchen table one afternoon while snow melted outside the windows, and Lily stared quietly at the bowl of pasta in front of her for nearly 30 seconds before softly asking, "Is it okay if I have more?" I remember just looking at her because my brain physically could not process why a child would ask permission to feed herself in her own home. Then I remembered North Peak monitored portions as punishment, rewards, discipline, obedience. Something inside my chest cracked quietly right there at the dinner table. "Baby," I said carefully, "you never have to ask me that again." She nodded like she understood, but the next day she asked again anyway. Trauma lives in repetition. Dr. Hannah Mercer became the first adult besides me that Lily slowly started trusting again. She was a child therapist with silver-streaked hair and the kind of calm voice that made rooms feel less dangerous the second she entered them. During our first meeting, she told me something I still think about constantly. "Children recover through safety," she said. "Not speeches, not pressure, repetition, predictability, presence." Presence. The word haunted me afterward because I realized how little of it I'd actually given my daughter before all this happened. Dr. Mercer encouraged Lily to draw again first, then softball later. No deadlines, no expectations, just pieces of herself returning slowly one fragment at a time. At first, Lily resisted both. Her sketchbooks remained closed on the desk for nearly 2 weeks untouched. Then one afternoon I came home from the hardware store and found charcoal dust smeared across the kitchen counter beside a half-finished drawing of pine trees and snow. I stood there staring at it longer than I probably should have because it felt like witnessing somebody breathe again after almost drowning. Small things became victories after that. Sleeping 5 hours without nightmares. Eating dinner without checking the clock nervously. Leaving her bedroom door partially closed instead of wide open. The first truly good moment happened nearly 3 months after the rescue. I was in the backyard fixing a broken shelf in the garage when I suddenly heard laughter. Real laughter. Not polite. Not forced. Bright, sharp laughter bursting unexpectedly through the open garage door. I froze instantly because I hadn't heard that sound from Lily in so long my body almost didn't recognize it anymore. I stepped closer quietly and saw her sitting on the garage floor covered in paint beside an old canvas while music played softly from her phone. Blue paint streaked across her cheek. Her hair tied messily back. She was laughing because the neighbor's dog had stepped directly into spilled paint and tracked blue paw prints across the concrete floor. Such a stupid little moment. Such an ordinary moment. And somehow it shattered me completely. I stood outside the garage where she couldn't see me and cried harder than I had the night we escaped North Peak. Not loud. Just silent, exhausted crying from someplace deep enough that I think part of me had been holding it back for years. I realized then that healing doesn't usually arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives disguised as a child laughing over blue footprints on a garage floor. A week later, Lily finally showed me the letters. We were cleaning her room together when she quietly pulled a taped bundle of folded papers from inside the lining of an old backpack. "I hid them," she whispered. My stomach tightened immediately. There were 12 letters total written in her uneven handwriting over the course of several weeks at North Peak. None had ever been mailed. Some were crumpled from being hidden too long. Others had water stains where tears blurred the ink. The first letter began normally enough. The third sounded frightened. By the sixth, the words barely looked like my daughter's anymore. "Please come get me. They say you don't want me there anymore. I'm trying to be good. I promise I'm trying." I had to stop reading twice because my hands were shaking too badly to continue. Lily sat beside me silently the entire time staring at the floor. "I didn't know if they'd find them," she said quietly. "So I hid copies." I looked at the stack of letters again and suddenly realized what they truly were. Evidence. Proof. Not just against North Peak, but against every lie that place had built itself upon. And somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the grief and guilt and fury, another feeling finally began growing slowly for the first time since all of this started. Hope. The trial began 9 months after the night I carried my daughter through a snowstorm while alarms screamed across the mountains behind us. By then the country already knew the name North Peak Leadership Academy. News stations had spent months tearing through everything investigators uncovered. The labor contracts hidden beneath nonprofit paperwork, the falsified therapy programs, the buried complaints stretching back years. Former students had started appearing publicly one after another, adults now, standing beneath television lights describing the same fear in different voices. Isolation. Punishment. Conditioning. The deliberate destruction of trust between children and their families. But sitting inside that courtroom on the first morning of the trial, none of the media coverage felt real to me anymore. Real was Lily beside me gripping a paper cup too tightly with both hands while pretending not to look nervous. Real was noticing she still flinched slightly whenever security doors closed loudly nearby. Real was understanding that justice doesn't erase damage. It only acknowledges it happened. Graham Voss entered the courtroom wearing a dark tailored suit that probably cost more than my first truck. If someone passed him on the street without context, they would have assumed he was a senator or university president. Calm posture. Silver hair perfectly combed. The same measured expression he'd worn the night I first saw him standing beneath cafeteria lights while frightened children went silent around him. Men like Voss build their entire lives around appearing respectable because respectability becomes armor once enough people depend on believing you're good. He never looked at the children seated in the courtroom gallery. Not once. That told me more than any testimony ever could. The prosecution spent weeks dismantling North Peak piece by piece. Financial analysts explained how the academy generated millions through leadership products manufactured almost entirely by child labor. Investigators revealed hidden workshop facilities where children built furniture sold through private distributors across 3 states. Medical experts testified about untreated injuries, sleep deprivation, malnutrition, and psychological conditioning techniques designed to create dependency through emotional isolation. Former staff members described reward systems based on food restriction and forced labor assignments. One former counselor cried openly while admitting they were instructed to tell children their families had chosen freedom from them. Every day more survivors testified. Some spoke confidently. Others barely held themselves together. One boy in his 20s described standing outside locked dormitories during winter storms believing for years that his parents genuinely no longer loved him because North Peak repeated it often enough that eventually resisting the idea hurt more than accepting it. Another former student explained how punishments escalated whenever children expressed homesickness because emotional attachment was labeled behavioral regression. Listening to them felt like slowly realizing how large the nightmare truly was. North Peak had not been one isolated evil moment. It had been an entire machine built over years to profit from damaged trust between parents and children. Vanessa testified on the 8th day. I almost couldn't watch. She looked smaller somehow standing alone in the witness box beneath courtroom lights, voice shaking while explaining how exhausted and overwhelmed she'd been before finding North Peak online. They sounded professional, she whispered through tears. Everything sounded reasonable. Structured schedules. Therapy. Accountability. Then her voice cracked completely. I wanted someone to help my daughter because I thought I was failing her. I didn't hate Vanessa anymore by then. Anger had burned itself out months earlier and left behind something heavier. Sadness maybe. Because the terrible truth was she hadn't sent Lily away because she stopped loving her. She sent her away because she stopped knowing how to reach her, and predators like Graham Voss survived by targeting exactly that kind of desperation. Lily testified near the end of the trial. The courtroom became so quiet that morning you could hear paper shifting whenever someone moved. She wore a dark blue sweater and kept rubbing charcoal dust unconsciously against her fingertips because she'd started carrying drawing pencils everywhere again. Small habits of safety. I sat behind her the entire time trying not to visibly shake while she walked toward the witness stand. Part of me still saw the terrified 13-year-old who asked whether she was allowed to eat dinner. But when she sat down and looked directly toward the jury, I realized something else too. She had become stronger than anyone in that courtroom fully understood. The defense attorney tried softening North Peak's image first. Troubled youth intervention, emotional correction, structured therapeutic environments. The same polished language Voss always used. Then finally Graham Voss himself testified. Calm, intelligent, controlled. We saved broken children, he said at one point while facing the jury with practiced sincerity. Many of these families came to us after every traditional solution had failed. For a moment the courtroom remained silent. Then the prosecutor asked Lily whether she wished to respond. Lily looked directly at Graham Voss before answering. Her voice never shook once. Broken children don't need prisons pretending to be schools. The silence afterward felt enormous. I watched several jurors physically shift in their seats because sometimes truth lands hardest when spoken simply. Then came the letters. The hidden copies Lily smuggled and protected beneath the lining of her backpack became the thing that finally destroyed the defense completely. 12 letters written over 7 weeks documenting emotional abuse in real time. Fear, isolation, punishments. Direct references to staff telling children their parents abandoned them permanently. The final letter ended with one sentence that prosecutors enlarged onto a courtroom screen for the jury. I'm trying to stay alive long enough for somebody to come back for me. I had to leave the courtroom for nearly 20 minutes after hearing that read aloud. Sentencing happened 3 weeks later. Graham Voss received 42 years in federal prison for child exploitation, unlawful imprisonment, labor trafficking, fraud, and abuse charges. Several senior staff members received sentences ranging from 8 to 25 years. North Peak Leadership Academy was permanently dissolved, its assets seized through federal order. The property itself was eventually demolished after investigators finished processing evidence. I watched the news coverage from our living room beside Lily while spring rain rolled softly against the windows outside. Neither of us celebrated much. Some victories are too painful to feel triumphant. Justice matters. But justice doesn't give children back the years stolen from them. 1 year later, life looked quieter. Smaller. Better. I worked at a local mechanic shop 15 minutes from home now instead of offshore platforms. The pay was worse. The hours longer in some ways. My hands still came home stained with grease and machine oil most nights. But every evening I walked through my own front door instead of staring at Gulf waters from steel platforms hundreds of miles away wondering whether my family was okay without actually being there to know. Lily rebuilt the garage into an art studio that summer. Paintings leaned against every wall now. Half-finished canvases, charcoal sketches, softball trophies slowly returning beside jars of paintbrushes and pencils. The nightmares still came sometimes, but less often. Healing is slow. Human beings are slower. One Friday afternoon I arrived early to her softball game carrying a paper bag full of burgers and still wearing paint stains across my hands from helping her install shelves in the studio before practice. The bleachers smelled like cut grass and summer heat. Parents shouted across the field while teenage girls warmed up near the dugouts beneath golden evening light. Lily jogged onto the field with her glove tucked beneath one arm, then stopped suddenly when she spotted me already sitting there waiting. Just a small moment. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but I did. That tiny pause in her expression before the smile appeared. Relief, recognition, trust. Because now she believed I'd actually show up. I lifted the bag of burgers toward her like an idiot, and she laughed before jogging back toward her team. And sitting there beneath the fading sunlight with grease under my fingernails and my daughter alive and healing in front of me, I finally understood something I wish I had learned years earlier. Some fathers save their children in a single moment. The hard part is showing up every day after that.